In our previous lectures, we had been discussing the ordeal of the Second World War, and we had further discussed the plans for the future that the Nazis had hatched, which were forestalled by their defeat in that conflict. But when World War II had ended, it didn't bring with it the peace that so many people longed for, but rather a new ideological confrontation, the Cold War, which we'll be discussing today. A point that we've underlined before in the context of our discussion of the First World War and of other conflicts is that even when they are brought to a formal or juridical end, they still continue in aftershocks. And in some sense, the Cold War would represent an aftershock, a settling of accounts that had built up during the Second World War as a new ideological confrontation loomed. As people took stock of the world in the aftermath of war, the costs were borne in upon them. The war, which had involved more than 40 nations, making it truly a global conflict, had left, by a conservative estimate, over 50 million dead. Some estimates range far higher. It's estimated by historians that roughly half of those who were victims of the war were civilians. This represented an intensification of that feature of total war that we'd already remarked on in our discussion of the First World War. In the First World War, it's estimated that some 10% of the victims of that conflict were civilians. Now that number, that proportion, had jumped to 50%. This represented a terrible intensification. And moreover, as a signal emblem of that intensification, the end of World War II had also ushered in a new age of weapons of even more formidable destructive power, the atomic age. A new age of potential destruction had been opened up, heretofore unknown to man. And these weapons would proliferate. While the United States had been first to use atomic weapons against Japan, by 1949, the Soviet Union had also produced a nuclear weapon, in part aided by espionage against its former allies. The Cold War now set in. According to many historians, the Cold War had already in essence been starting to play itself out in the Second World War, especially in its closing stages. World War II had seen an uneasy alliance of the United States and Britain, Western democracies, on the one hand, with Stalin and his Soviet Union on the other side. This uneasy alliance had already been strained during the war, but as the war ended, hopes, reasonably enough, were still present that international cooperation might be continued past the conflict, despite the stark, some argued, irreconcilable ideological differences between the former allies. But these differences, however, soon led to what came to be called a Cold War, not a hot war of active armed conflict, but rather a tense standoff that threatened at any moment to turn into an all-out armed confrontation, an ideological standoff that lasted nearly half a century and did much to shape our world in the present day. With the end of the Second World War and in its closing stages, people, quite understandably, were gathering their thoughts on the sort of international efforts that might pool the resources of an international community, that might assure human rights, that might seem to ground hopes in peace. And the United Nations in particular was held up as one such international institution that, as a successor to the League of Nations project, might finally vindicate those hopes. The United Nations organization was founded at the San Francisco Conference from April to June of 1945. The United Nations Charter defined its aims. And these were the noble aims of peace through collective security, the promise of self-determination, the notion of international cooperation and shared progress, and respect for human rights. The structure of the United Nations was one that was intended as a compromise between these ideals and the demands of political realism and diplomacy. There was a General Assembly in which nations would participate, at least in theory, as equals. while above the General Assembly, a so-called Security Council wields real power. Its 5 permanent members are the victors of World War II: the United States, the Soviet Union, Great Britain, China, and France. To the dismay of those who had vested such hopes in the United Nations, however, the recognition soon dawned that Cold War tensions impeded its functioning along the lines that they had imagined. To give but one example, the Soviets demanded and got extra seats in the General Assembly for constituent republics of the Soviet Union, Ukraine, and Belarus. Within the Security Council, vetoes by the Soviet Union or by its opponents in the Cold War tended all too often to immobilize that body and prevented its effective functioning. Nonetheless, further hopes were vested in an articulation of what were taken to be shared common principles. And one very important example of just such a public articulation of shared ideals, at least in theory shared, was the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. This was approved on December 10th, 1948, in Paris. It remained, however, a non-binding expression of the ideals of aspiring for the respect of human rights, which unfortunately all too many member states of the United Nations violated and still continue to violate to this very day. There were also other accounts that needed to be settled in the aftermath of the Second World War. One outstanding issue was what was to be done with the defeated Nazi Germany. The regime, which its authors had expected would last 1,000 years, Hitler's Third Reich, had collapsed. What was now to be done to reckon up the crimes of that regime? Observers, contemporary observers, including Hannah Arendt, noted that when one traveled in post-war Germany, one could note a bizarre phenomenon. It seemed as if all of the Nazis had disappeared. People now presented themselves as having been either active resistors or passive inward objectors to the Nazi regime, and Hannah Arendt and others observed that it was very difficult to find publicly professed Nazis in the aftermath of this war. It seemed that the collapse of the regime had been total and the regime's ideology had been discredited. But now the question still presented itself how to deal with its crimes. And this was in part answered at the Nuremberg war crimes trials. In the city of Nuremberg in southern Germany, from 1945 to 1947, prominent Nazi leaders were tried by Allied judges for crimes against humanity. The very term was significant because it emphasized that new stress on human rights, which was so hopefully current in the immediate post-war period. Now, some critics of these war crimes trials pointed out the irony of Soviet judges passing verdicts against their ideological allies from before, now ideological defeated former allies, while Soviet crimes like Katyn were in fact not even considered. One thing was clear, however: the sentences that were finally leveled against these Nazi leaders were richly deserved. The war crimes trials also accomplished something far larger than holding individuals accountable. It was also important in setting down the historical facts of the regime and its crimes. It laid down a historical record, which would be of enormous significance in spreading common knowledge of these events. We had discussed in an earlier lecture how, in the aftermath of the First World War, in Germany there had arisen a stab-in-the-back legend that argued that Germany had in fact never really been defeated, but that inner enemies were to blame. The finality of Germany's defeat in the Second World War and the Nuremberg war crimes trials, with their registering of a public record, made it clear that no such legend or paranoid myth was tenable in the post-war period. The process of an entire society, of German society, coming to terms with and acknowledging the crimes that had been committed in its name was not simply one limited to the immediate post-war period, but indeed was a longer process, only really gaining steam in the 70s and the 80s, and indeed is still ongoing, a wrenching confrontation with the burden of the past. Another legacy of the immediate post-war period and the emphasis on human rights was the Genocide Convention. In 1948, the United Nations General Assembly passed the Genocide Convention, which made genocide an international crime. The term genocide was a new one, the phenomenon obviously one that had a much longer history. In part, its popularization of this term was due to one man, a crusading jurist by the name of Raphael Lemkin. Raphael Lemkin was a Polish Jewish refugee who had come to the United States, and he represented a lonely prophetic voice in arguing that people who committed what before then had been a crime without a name needed internationally to be held to account. He in fact had already been thinking in these terms before the Nazi genocide. In the course of the 1920s, he had been shocked and dismayed to hear of the Armenian genocide of the First World War and had struggled with the implications, both legal and moral, of the existence of such crimes. He crusaded, ultimately successfully, for the prescription of this crime of genocide, a word that he had invented by combining the Greek word for a tribe or an ethnic group, genos, with the Latin word for murder, side. The term was defined in ways that were controversial then and are still controversial today. The convention defined it, the crime of genocide, as the intent to destroy in whole or in part national, ethnic, racial, or religious groups. Some critics argued that this particular definition might set the bar too high. Certain crimes might be downplayed, as it were, because they didn't meet all the definition's requirements. Others argued that the bar might be set too low, pointing out that the question of determining intent was a notoriously difficult one, and people are still wrestling with the question of which particular atrocities qualify for the full term of genocide and which fall short of it. So the question remains controversial today. The convention's effect has also been slow to be felt, as we'll see in our following lectures when we examine particular cases of international inaction in the face of what clearly meets these criteria of genocide. At the same time as laws and conventions were seeking to draw some conclusions from the experience of the previous decade, in the terms of literature, another lesson was drawn, and that was to be seen in George Orwell's great novel of dystopia, 1984. The British journalist George Orwell wrote his dystopian novel, 1984, in the year 1948. He simply reversed the years of his writing to indicate a coming future not all too distant. He depicted a society of totalitarian rule, drawing on contemporary trends, particular modes of government and modes of politics that he observed in his own world around him, and this is significant, his own reading of Zemyatin's classic dystopian novel of the Soviet Union, written in 1920, his novel We. In 1984, perhaps the most famous of the dystopian novels of the 20th century, his protagonist, by the name of Winston Smith, lives in a society dominated, totally dominated, by the omnipresent, mysterious Big Brother and a dominant party. In terms of the novel's plot line, outer repression, as well as inner resistance within Winston himself, dooms him and his love for a young woman. Winston Smith works in the Ministry of Truth, which is devoted entirely to the task of revising historical records to bring them into line with the shifting version of the truth of the party, and is engaged in the constant purging of the past, throwing outdated and now untrue historical records into what Orwell very notably called the memory hole, a sort of incinerator. A political language was developed by Big Brother's regime entitled Newspeak, which was aimed at the task of eliminating thought crime, eliminating the very possibility of thinking thoughts that were not approbated by the regime. When we consider the resemblance that this sort of linguistic control of a society depicted in Orwell's novel has, we think of Viktor Klemperer, that analyst of Nazi perversion of the German language, and see some remarkable parallels. In the novel, Winston Smith resists the system, but ultimately he's tracked down and broken and betrays his love for Julia and his own humanity. In this novel, Orwell's vision is dark and pessimistic. The future is presented, in the words of one of the interrogators of Winston Smith as he's being broken, as a dark one, full of hatred forever. This interrogator tells his victim, if you want a picture of the future, imagine this: a boot stamping on a human face forever. The interrogator promised that what would follow upon the triumph of the regime and suppressing the last resistance would be a world of terror, not a utopia of love or of peace, but a world of terror based on hatred and domination, which were equally parts of human nature. It's remarkable to observe that in this story, in which George Orwell emphasized the conviction that totalitarian regimes had of the malleability of human nature and their ability to manipulate, that one could actually see many of the features of contemporary regimes, or in some cases even anticipations of later authoritarian practice in the world at large. But George Orwell's novel was not simply about the regimes that he observed in the present day. His pessimistic message was a wider one. It had to do with a human susceptibility, as he saw it, to the lure of tyranny, the promise of order and stability, even at the price of the extinguishing of human nature. And indeed, even in these hopeful times of the first years of the post-war period, observers who looked around could certainly see portents that were far more troubling than the high hopes of this post-war period. And these included massive forced population movements and ethnic cleansing in Europe itself. World War II had left 11 million refugees on the European continent and many more million in other parts of the world. These were now, as it were, a new kind of person, stateless, unmoored, homeless, and bureaucratically they were labeled displaced persons. In Hannah Arendt's reflections on the 20th century, she argued that the 20th century might have to be considered the century of the displaced person or of the refugee. Among those who were displaced or actively expelled were ethnic Germans in Eastern Europe. Some 15 million ethnic Germans fled or were expelled from Eastern European countries where they had lived as minorities, in some cases for centuries previous, especially from Poland and Czechoslovakia. They were expelled in part in a cycle of revenge against Nazi crimes committed against Eastern European peoples. And to note this human tragedy in no way minimizes the guilt of the Nazis, in no way exculpates their crimes, but rather underlines the vicious nature of cycles of revenge and violence in modern history. At the Potsdam Conference, where Great Britain, the United States, and the Soviet Union gathered in July to August of 1945, the Allies approved what they called the humane and orderly transfer of such people. They referred in particular to a precedent that we've already discussed in an earlier lecture, the precedent of the 1923 Lausanne Treaty, which had established what were supposed to be, at least in theory, humane population transfers between Greece and Turkey in the aftermath of the First World War. That process had been violent. This new underwritten process of population transfer after World War II was also enormously violent, with an estimated 3 million dead. The rhetoric of humanity and concern for humanitarian issues covered up a brutal reality. And beyond this, over 2 million refugees from Eastern Europe were also forcibly deported or returned to Eastern Europe and to Stalin's control, where they were killed or jailed. A terrible fate had awaited them. Within the areas of his control, Joseph Stalin now clamped down in recognition of the growing tensions of the Cold War. One needs to distinguish between Stalin's policies in an outer empire of the areas dominated by the conquering Red Army, and his policies of reconsolidating his control in an inner empire of the Soviet Union itself. Let's consider first the outer empire of Eastern Europe. Claiming security needs and omitting to mention that the invasion of the Nazis had been an invasion of his own allies, Stalin demanded an outer empire of Eastern European so-called people's republics, ruled by communists after a period of shared government in coalition. Within the inner empire of the Soviet Union itself, Stalin now clamped down again. You'll recall that at the start of the battle between the Nazis and the Soviets, Stalin had implicitly seemed to offer the promise of liberalization if only ordinary Soviet citizens would rally to the cause of the defense of the motherland. These promises were now betrayed. Stalin returned to his rhetoric of addressing the peoples of the Soviet Union no longer as fellow Russians or fellow members of a homeland, but rather as comrades. And a very vivid example of this was the fate of Soviet prisoners of war. You'll recall that those Soviet prisoners of war who had fallen into Nazi hands were often allowed to die of neglect in the millions. Stalin now meted out to them a cruel fate to those who survived. Ipso facto, Stalin considered soldiers who had allowed themselves to be taken prisoner traitors. So as they were loaded onto trains and brought back to home, to Moscow, to other Russian cities, their trains didn't stop to unload them there. Instead, these trains with prisoners of war, now liberated, in quotation marks, sped on through to Siberia. They were shipped there by cattle car to labor camps to pay for the crime of having been captured. The novel of Alexander Solzhenitsyn, entitled One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich, portrayed this man's own experiences in the Gulag of this period. He had been an artillery officer in the Red Army. He had been a committed fighter in the Russian cause, but he'd been arrested in 1945 for making critical remarks about Stalin and was subjected to 8 years in prison. He depicted in this novel the brutal realities of the Gulag camp, and later would be awarded the Nobel Prize in 1970 for this depiction. This account of the brutal existence of ordinary prisoners one day in the life bore a punchline that was ironic, and that punchline was essentially that this, on balance, had been a good day for a prisoner since he had survived. Other peoples were to be punished wholesale for their real or suspected disloyalty. They were deported or decimated. Before the war's end in 1944, Chechens, Ingush, and Crimean Tatars, non-Russian peoples living in the Soviet Union, were all deported from the Caucasus and the Crimea to Central Asia because of Stalin's suspicions. 500,000 Chechens and Ingush were deported, 189,000 Tatars, with great losses to their populations. And the conflict that still rages in Chechnya, in the Russian Federation today, cannot be understood without this long-term background. Mass deportations also resumed in the Baltics, following on earlier deportations of 1941. Hundreds of thousands were deported to Siberia. Scarcely any families were left untouched, and it's estimated that 15% of the Baltic populations were gone by 1950. In a sense, World War II also continued in Eastern Europe even after 1945. The so-called Baltic Forest War saw guerrillas fighting Soviet forces well into the 1950s. The Cold War would also grow in intensity in the following years. Stalin stated that a territory's occupier determined and had a right to determine its social system. He worked with communist allies in Eastern European countries to consolidate their rule. In 1947, non-communist parties were dropped from government in Eastern European countries, one after the other: Hungary, Romania, Poland. In 1948, a communist coup in Czechoslovakia also created sole rule on the part of the communists. In October 1947, the Comintern, which had been shut down to continue good relations with the Western democracies, was now revived under the new name of the Cominform. Communist parties in Italy and France also enjoyed considerable popularity and prestige due to anti-Nazi resistance, and it seemed to many hopeful internationalists that communism was progressing on all fronts. But Stalin then died in 1953. It's been suggested that he was perhaps on the eve of another wave of purges. Authorities had announced in months previous the discovery of an alleged doctor's plot. Government doctors, mostly Jewish in origin, were accused of preparing a wide conspiracy to poison Soviet leaders. Stalin's regime seemed to be taking a radical anti-Semitic turn before his death, and it's suggested that the Jews of the Soviet Union might have been the next target of his paranoia. What followed in the Soviet Union was a process of de-Stalinization. In 1956, Nikita Khrushchev, the following leader, gave a speech at the Congress of the Communist Party in which he denounced Stalin's crimes, especially those against the Communist Party. Khrushchev now announced a new policy of coexistence and competition with the West, promising that the West would be buried technologically. Nonetheless, Soviet control in Eastern Europe often needed to be secured through violence. Soviet forces suppressed uprisings in East Germany, in Poland, in Hungary, and then in Czechoslovakia. At the same time, the Soviets hoped to forge ahead with new science and technology that would put them in the forefront of development. The launch of the Sputnik satellite in 1957 and the prestige of nuclear weapons gave the Soviet Union an image of progress, but below the surface there were significant failures of development, some of which can be summed up in one example, that of the crackpot agricultural theories of Trofim Lysenko. Lysenko believed that genetic theories were invalid, they were a bourgeois invention, and that in fact, characteristics that had been taught to plants could be passed on through the generations. He urged a socialist, communist model of agriculture. Plants could cooperate to grow better, he argued, and thus he urged the planting very close together of grain and of other crops. Well, the predictable thing happened. All of these plants died, starved of the opportunity to grow individually. Further, he hatched a plan called the Great Stalin Plan for the Transformation of Nature, in which he urged the warming of Siberia's climate by planting of trees, and urged the transformation of the physical environment of the Soviet Union itself. Such theories would be disastrous in practice, and they clue us into an abiding paradox. Regimes of the nature of the Soviet Union claimed to be scientific, but they would often fall prey to such pseudo-scientific, disastrous theories. The Cold War involved choices and dividing lines, and they didn't run neatly in a geographical sense between one East and one Western world. In fact, Alexander Solzhenitsyn had compared the ideological conflicts of the Great Cold War to a line running through individuals themselves, who needed to determine where their sympathies lay. The blocks of East and West, in spite of our talking in that way, were in fact not monolithic. Individual sympathies and allegiances could vary greatly. Now, while the Cold War did not erupt, thankfully, into a full-scale clash, it did cause proxy wars or substitute wars, such as America's involvement in the Vietnam War or the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. And indeed, as has been pointed out, frequently alliances on both sides could often contradict ideological consistency and lead them into relations with unsavory regimes. There was one symbol above all of the Cold War that deserves mention, and that was the wall that divided the Germanys. Eastern Germany under communist control from a Western Germany under the sponsorship of the Western Allies. On occupying Eastern Germany, Soviet forces had engaged in abuse of civilians and mass rapes in a cycle of revenge for Nazi atrocities. It's been argued that this experience would fatally undercut support for the German communists that might otherwise have arisen. In the Eastern Soviet zone, the German Democratic Republic was declared in October of 1949 in reaction to the setting up of a Western German Republic under Western sponsorship earlier in that year. But this was a regime which experienced massive population flight, a brain drain especially of the best and brightest, who flocked instead to the West. In order to deal with this hemorrhaging of population, the East German authorities, with the sanction of the Soviet Union, built the Berlin Wall on August 13, 1961. This wall, which at first ran through the divided capital of the Germany's Berlin, soon extended across the extent of Germany itself from north to south, dividing Eastern Germany from the West. It was called, in significant ideological terms, an anti-fascist protection wall. But in fact, this symbol of division was meant to keep people in. In the course of the following decades, some 900 people died trying to escape westwards. A further phenomenon, which was indicative of the tense standoff of the Cold War, was the phenomenon of what was called, in a suitable acronym, MAD, M-A-D, mutually assured destruction. It became especially clear in the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962 over the stationing of Soviet missiles in Cuba, where Fidel Castro had taken power in 1959 and had come under the orbit of the Soviet Union, which seemed to bring the world to the brink of nuclear war. This frightened both opponents and was followed by attempts at détente, relaxing tensions. But what followed in the coming decades was nonetheless a balance of terror. A key concept of deterrence, assured destruction, argued that nuclear aggression could be prevented by the implicit threat of a second nuclear strike, which would meet any first attack, obliterating the attacker and rendering victory and defeat meaningless to both sides. This clearly was a balance of terror, which globally kept the world in an uneasy peace, but threatened at any time to tip over into Armageddon and apocalypse. In our next lecture, we'll be considering another player emerging in the Cold War, the great China of Chairman Mao.